Hello, welcome to JavaScript Marathon Training presented by This.Labs. We're so happy to be back with you this month after our inaugural marathon training sessions back in April. My name is Tara Hampton and I will be your host today. In our Vue track, we will be walking through the new composition API that will be released as a part of Vue 3. Today's trainer is Jake Dome. Jake is a developer at Simply Good Work and organizer at Triangle.js. Jake, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. You can find Jake on Twitter using the handle shown at the bottom of the screen. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with him if you have any questions or feedback following the session. And of course, we couldn't do this without our sponsors. Our sponsor today is This.Labs, your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. You can find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Do you find keeping up with the constantly evolving technologies a struggle? Do you want to bring your team up to speed on one of the latest technologies? This.Labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. Contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. And you can tune in every third Thursday of the month for Vue Online meetups. This.'s online meetups are an amazing opportunity for developers and enthusiasts alike to engage with the global tech community no matter where you are in the world. You can get information and register to join at vuemeetup.com. All right, Jake, I am going to kick it over to you.
Perfect.
And there you go.
Okay. All right. Well, I am going to jump right in to the meat of this. Hi, I'm Jake. I've been introduced already, but I just wanted to let you know I am wearing a Vue hat, so you can 100% trust me. There's no reason that I would have a hat if I didn't know what I was talking about. So I am going to show you the Vue composition API today. This is a new API coming in Vue 3, which I'm really, really excited about. It's going to give us the ability to do a lot of things that we previously either haven't been able to do before or we've been able to do, but it hasn't really been in an ideal way. One of my favorite things about Vue is that it's really easy to work with and most things make sense in Vue. And when you are trying to figure out how to do something, I've found when using Vue, the way you find out how to do it really makes sense. And it's easy to do. It makes it fits into the Vue paradigm. And one of the things that hasn't really fit into that, or we haven't really had a first party way to do, is this way to share functionality between multiple components, multiple parts of your app, or even multiple apps within the Vue paradigm. So what am I talking about? For instance, I've got this articles page, right? And I've got this pagination built in. This is a little dummy app I cooked up for this training. And it's got articles and videos. All these articles and videos are from the Good Work blog. I work for a company called Simply Good Work, and we do web consulting. And this is a bunch of our articles on how to do different things on the web. And so I've got this pagination. And if you kind of see how that's cooked up, this is very normal Vue code. Drop into the comments if you have any questions as I'm going, or if there's any little bits of the stream that need some refining. Please let me know. Let me know if the code's too small or if you can't see anything or my mic sounds bad. Drop in and let me know. But looking at this app here, we've got this pagination on the articles page, but we don't have it on the videos page. And this is kind of a common problem in Vue because Vue has this concept of components, which is amazing and powerful. It's really what Vue is based around. And that's for sharing pieces of UI across your app, right? So if you have two pieces of similar UI, like, this articles link and this videos link, say they're a little more complicated, they're similar UI. So you could write a component so that you could have two similar pieces and share your UI across those two components. But one thing that we haven't really had the right way to express is sharing functionality with reactive data across your app. So a good example of this is what I was talking about here. What if I wanted to take my pagination code for what I'm doing right here, which is, I've just got a method, some data, some computer properties, and I wanted to wrap that up and make it very agnostic. A component doesn't really make sense because you could be using this pagination for something that looks like this or something that looks like anything else. So to share that logic across our app, obviously for normal logic, like, if you want to take a string and uppercase it, say we didn't have a nice to uppercase on the string for that, you could create a function that just uppercase that string for you. And that works within Vue too. Vue's straight JavaScript, so you can make and use reuse functions. So for things that are just basic utils, that problem is already solved. But for things that has stateful logic, for example, this pagination of it has data, it has reactive data that our UI needs to be able to track and react to. There's not really a paradigm for that in Vue. Up to this point, there's been two ways to do it. You can have a renderless component, which you pass in some props and it can return things to you through a scope slot, which is a really nice API, but it doesn't always make sense and it's got some downfalls. For instance, you can only use the things returned from that renderless component in your UI. So you couldn't make a computer property off of one of those pieces of data. The other way that you had to do it was you could use a mixin, and mixins worked pretty well for this because you could have some things like this, like posts and filtered posts, computer property, and mixin, and then up here in your component you could just say mixins, and then you could say we're going to use this like pagination mixin or something like that. It's a pretty simple interface. But the problem with that is it would inject these kind of random properties, like, if you had a post as part of your mixin. So for example, say we had a mixin called pagination and it looked like this. It had some data, which was posts, and it just, had an array of posts, and then it had a computer property down here. You get I'm getting at here. I can't type on the stream. And I said filtered. I'm gonna bump this code up one here. Thanks for checking in. So computed, and you said like paginated posts. And that did some stuff, and say it just returned another array. And then you could kind of use that mixin down here. And this may not be the exact syntax. I'm not really a mixins person for the most part. But you could kind of call that mixin by just passing it in here. And what it would do is it would inject the properties that are on this mixin, like posts and paginated posts, directly into your component. But say this was abstracted into another file, right? So all you're doing here is like import pagination from pagination. Say it was like a library. You don't know that like a post key is coming from this, right? It's very implicit. It's very magical. So if you had two different libraries that maybe had the same key, those could conflict. And just in general, in software development, one of the best rules is knowing where things come, right? Having traceable code. So this was not a traceable way to manage this. So in Vue 3, the Vue core team set out to solve this problem, and they solved it by coming up with the composition API. So I'm going to jump into some of what those APIs look like. What we're going to do is we're going to refactor our pagination and our filtering logic. This is a little filter that we've got going on, so I can filter our posts and then we paginate them. We're going to refactor both of those features into using the composition API, and then we're going to implement them and show how easy it is once you've refactored them to implement them on the videos page so that we can filter and search and paginate the videos also. And then we're going to look at some best practices and some common mistakes that you can make when using the composition API. So I'm going to hop back into my code here. The first thing we're going to do is refactor the filtering to use the composition API. So the first part of the composition API, so the composition API consists of a few things. It consists of a new key that goes in your function called setup. This is a almost a life cycle hook that runs right before the created hook. So that's kind of when it runs. So it'll run before your data and methods and such are processed, or before any of the other lifecycle hooks, at least. So the first thing we want to look at is the setup hook. The setup hook allows you to do any type of data manipulation, pulling in data, or creating reactive data, which is the second part, which we'll look at in a second. And all you have to do to expose it to your template is return it. So to show how this works, I'm going to create a key here called message, and we're going to say hello, Vue marathon world. Okay, and then we're going to come up into our template, and we're just going to toss a h1 in here, and we're going to render our message. And there you go. Hello, Vue marathon world, right? So all we're doing here is returning it from the setup function. So anything you do in the setup function, if you want to expose it to either your other methods and computer properties or the rest of your script, you can return it. Or if you want to expose it to your template, you can return it. So knowing that, let's clear this out. I don't think we'll be needing that. Let's clear that out. And we're going to start to refactor the different pieces of our filtering logic into the setup function. So let's come down here and we're going to say const, what's our first thing as part of this? Okay, so we've got a filtered post computed property. So what we need to do, and we've got some data to go along with that too, right? Because we have our search query, which is what we're filtering by. So search query is data, so it's reactive. So even in the setup function, we can't just say const search query equals an empty string and then return that, because that is just a primitive value, right? That's not reactive data. We need something to turn our non-reactive data and make it, a Vue reactive data, a very normal part of Vue. So the way that we do that is by importing a new helper, which is exposed by Vue. So we're going to come up here and we're going to import ref from Vue. So a ref is a way to have reactive data within, outside of the options landscape using this data key. So what we're going to do is we're going to say search query is a ref, and it's going to start as an empty string. We're just passing in the default value here. So see, this search query is exactly the same, is going to behave exactly the same as this search query down here in data. So I can remove that and refresh the page, and everything is still going to work as it did before, because this ref is reactive. So if we kind of console logged out, or if we rendered out the search query, we'll see that it's still updating because it's v-modeled to this input. So if we kind of refresh the page here and we type ADA, you'll see that as I type, it is updating, and that's because it's reactive. It's reactive because it's a ref. And I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but one thing you need to know about refs is that they wrap up the data which you pass in an object wrapper. And this is because of kind of a limitation of JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't natively have a way for you to have reactive data. So for that to be able to work, we have to kind of get around it by wrapping it in an object and then returning that object. So ref doesn't return this string value directly. It actually returns. So if we looked at what it returned, it would look like this. It returns value and then whatever our value is. So if we said initial, then that would be this. So this is the return. And we can see that by console.logging, and we'll just console log our ref. So let's refresh and look at that. And none of these posts are showing up because we set it to initial. If we look here, it's a ref. It's not it doesn't console log out initial, but if we console log ref value, then it will console log out. Sorry, not ref value, search query value. It'll console log out initial. And if we console log out search query, which is the return from this ref function call, it'll say, it's got this value and it's got this key telling us that it's a ref returned from Vue. So that'll become more important. We'll get into that in a second, but just know that refs return an object which wraps your value, and that's because of some limitations of JavaScript, and this is the way that's worked around. So refs allow you to have reactive data in Vue outside of the normal component instance. And we'll look at even how you can use a ref or reactive data outside of a component at all in a little bit. So that's the first thing we need to do. So the second thing we need to refactor this filtering feature is a computed property. So we're going to come down here and we're going to say const filtered posts, right, equals. And we need to be able to filter, just like I'm doing down here, filter these posts based on some reactive data. If you've ever wanted to do any filtering or change anything based on reactive data in Vue, you know that the thing you're going to reach for is a computed property. But again, we're outside of the normal component methods here, outside of the normal options API where we would normally do it like this. So this is another new part of the composition API that Vue exposes. So we can come up and say update our imports to import the computed function. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call computed, and we're just going to pass it a function which it will process and return the result of. And then we're just going to take everything we have down here out of our normal computed property and move it up. And all of this seems like, we already had it working. Why are we doing this? We're going to look at that. And there's actually a couple benefits, not just one, to doing this, but it's going to make us be able to abstract this logic into a way that's shareable across pages, components, really shareable across anywhere in your application. So we're going to define query as this.search query. That's wrong, right? Because we're now inside of the composition API. So we're not going to be using this. Inside of setup, this does not exist, or it doesn't mean what it normally does in Vue. Because you're able to access your initial data just by the variable name, right? We don't really need this anymore. So we're going to replace this. We're going to get rid of that, and we're going to say our query is a search query, right? But then we also need to access dot value because we want to get the value of whatever this ref contains. So we're going to say the query is search query dot value. And if there's no query, then we're just going to return all the posts. That's still what we want to do. And we're just normalizing this by lowercasing it. This is just normal search stuff. And then we're filtering the posts. And we've got the item. And I think the rest of this is correct. And we're returning all posts here. So we're just returning something from this computed property. And filtered post is, so we need to take this, and because like I said, if you want to expose it to your template, you have to return it. So I'm going to come down here and return filtered post, and let's change this back to an empty string instead of the initial value, because none of our post titles contain that initial. And I'm just going to come down here and I'm going to type ADA, and you'll see that it's going to pull up this article with the ADA. We've still got our reactive data, and this computed property is working, and that's working in a way that's Vue agnostic, right? It's still related to Vue's reactivity system, but it's not directly tied into this component. So we could copy and paste this code and use it anywhere. So the next feature that we want to refactor, and then we're going to look at kind of how this helps us. We're going to quickly refactor our second feature, which is the pagination. So we're going to come down here, and what do we need to do first? We've got a piece of data, right? So we're going to say const page equals, and this is reactive data. So we're just going to use a ref, and we're going to set that to 1. And then we need a method. And how would you do methods, right? Because there's not a key. We're not going to come down here and say like const methods or something like that, right? This really simplifies and brings us closer to back to JavaScript. We've got these little helpers that help us do Vue specific reactivity things, but when you want to do something, what do you do in JavaScript? You write a function, right? So we're just going to create a function called show more posts, and then that is going to update our page, right? So we're going to just say page plus plus. So if you look at what we're doing down here, it's very similar, except that we don't need to access it on this dot because it's a local variable. So let's get rid of this method. Let's get rid of this. I think we can get rid of this too. So we're down to just computed properties, right? We don't have any posts left here. And we're going to refactor these computed properties. Like I've already showed how we can refactor computed properties. So if you've been following, you'll know that we're going to do const paginated posts equals computed, and we're going to use that helper. We're just going to open up a new function, and then we're just going to make it work with the composition API, change any things that we need to. So down here, we've got page length times page. And then down here, we're just filtering our posts, and filtered posts is no longer on this. It's just a local variable right up here. So we need to get rid of that. All right, so we've got some errors here going on. So let's see what this one is. This one is going to be because we're not returning it. So we need to return show more posts and paginated posts. That's going to clear up some of our errors. If we look here and I hover over this error, let's see if it'll pop up for me. I don't think it wants to. But if you look at my window over here, you'll see that page is a constant. So we don't want to reassign that. But that's not really the error that we really have. The error that we really have, and this is really nice that Vue's already giving me these errors, even though I'm using the Vue 3 beta here. So I'm on a beta. I should have said this at the beginning. This code will not work in your production Vue 2 applications. There's a plugin which will let you do parts of this, but this will be available in Vue 3. So I'm using the Vue 3 beta. And Vue 3 already has some nice errors for me telling me you must use dot value to read or write the value wrapped by ref. So if I come up here and look at this, like this looks like it should be right. But like I said, because ref returns a wrapped value, what we need to do is page dot value. And the same thing down here for page, and we'll do that page dot value. And filtered posts, because it's a computed property, computed properties also return a ref, right? So all we're doing up here is a normal computed property, which takes a function and returns a value. But so that that computed property can be reactive, which is really the whole point of computed properties, it needs to wrap that in a ref for us. So we're going to say filtered post dot value. This is something that will bite you every once in a while. It's going to bite you for a while when you're starting out with the composition API. Just getting used to using that value. It makes sense why you have to do it. I may put out another video on why you have to do it at some point too, because once you understand kind of the explanation behind why, it's really a JavaScript thing. It makes sense and you can get comfortable with it. You can get used to it. But at the beginning, it just takes a little easing into. So the dev tools are really nice. Obviously, I'd try to work within an IDE like this. This is VS Code as much as possible, so you can avoid as many errors as possible. Our last error here is just this paginated post. We got to clear that out because we already rebuilt that. And if we come down here, you'll see that our functionality still works. And I'm going to clear out the console so it doesn't look like we have any errors. All of our functionality still works. So we've replicated our reactive data. We've replicated our paginated posts. And we've used computer properties and reactive data to do that, right? Another really, really cool thing, which you probably may have noticed up to this point, is that you can use the composition API alongside your current code. So I've refactored 99% of this component to be using the composition API, and I've put almost all of my logic in the setup function. But because of the way this is designed in a really smart way, the setup function runs before the other life cycles and before like your computer properties do. So you can refactor parts of your app to use the parts that maybe need it, the parts that are modular to use the composition API, but you can leave parts of it in the options API if you want to, right? So we've still got this computer property, which is just calculating if we can show more posts, right? So that's just deciding whether this should be disabled or enabled. So it's normally enabled, but then once the filtered post length, once the normal length of post matches the paginated length, we know that there's no more to reveal, so we can hide that. This is a computer property running in the normal Vue way that you're familiar with, but it's running alongside our composition API code just fine. That's a really attractive part of the composition API, is that there's not really unless you write something in the composition API or you pull in an external library that uses the composition API, there's not really a push to migrate your existing code, which is really helpful because as much as I love the composition API, it doesn't always make sense to have to go binary for each component, not just for the whole app. For this component will be the composition API. This component will be what we're used to in Vue, which we call the options API. You can mix and match those as much as you want to. So that's a really, really nice thing. I think my default will probably still stay the options API, and I'll probably just use that setup function to pull in any bits of functionality that I need to share across my app. So I think I'll use that setup key in my options API pretty often. I think I'll use it in probably more components than I don't, but I won't do all of my logic in there because I'm comfortable with Vue. I like the way Vue normally works in Vue 2, and that API isn't going anywhere. Okay, little tangent done. Let's refactor this last little bit of options API code. So we're going to say can show more posts, and we're just going to create a computer property here. I'm going to rush through this for time's sake. There's not really anything super interesting here. And we're just going to copy this, get rid of our last piece of non-composition API code, return it, and we're going to return it from here. I'll drop that down for us. And we'll say filtered post dot value because that's a ref, and paginated post dot value because that's a ref. And we should be back to our existing functionality, but implemented in the Vue composition API. So we've looked at three main concepts: the setup function, which there's more to know about. You can like accept your props in the setup function. You can accept the context so that you can, like get the root element or something like that, or things that you don't have access to right now as params. So we could say like, I think it's props context, but we don't really need that. There's more to know about the setup function, but it's generally the way you use these new composition API functions, right? So that's the first thing we know. The second thing we know is that you can do reactive data. So you have this ref here, which provides reactive data outside of the normal way to do reactive data in Vue. And we have a way to do computer properties. So these are kind of our core components of Vue, right? Reactivity, computer properties. We'll also look at watchers. Watchers is another thing you can do with the composition API. But one really interesting side effect of refactoring this, right? So all we have in our component now, wrong thing. All we have in our component is we're exporting. We've got our components key, which it stays. Nothing changes with the composition API for components, or if we have props, those would go right here too. So setup lives right alongside your normal way to use Vue. But if you look at it, before we had, if you were paying attention while we refactored, in the data, we had, like a piece of data that went with the filtering, a piece of data that went with the pagination, right? And those things were beside each other because they were both data. And then we have methods, right? And so we had computer properties also. And we had a computer property that went with the filtering and two computer properties that went with the pagination. And all those things were beside each other because they were related. But when you look at it now and the way that this code is written, if we break it down, this part of the code is for filtering and this part of the code is for pagination. So it's really a different way to organize your code, because instead of organizing it by what it does, you organize it by what it's related to. So all of this code that's related to each other is now beside each other, right? We have the page, which we're then mutating in page.value++ in our show more posts method. It's just a basic function, but and then we've got these computer properties, which rely on this page variable and some other data. But all of this logic that goes together lives together in this block. So where before this would have been spread out, like this would be data, so it would be over here, and this would be a method, so it would be over here, and these were computed, so these two would be together, but that's kind of by chance. Now our code is really organized by feature, which when you have multiple features in an component, like in this example, is really a nice thing to have, because it kind of helps you parse your code well. So as you get into it, just be aware of that. Figure out if you like it. Figure out if you can get used to it as the way you like to work. Personally, really like this way of code organization better than the options API, because the options API kind of unnecessarily makes you organize your code by type instead of by feature. I really like this way. I think it's really helpful. I think it's kind of a side benefit that came along with the other benefits, but that's kind of a cool thing to keep your eye on as you use the composition API. I think it will be a benefit in the long run, though it does take some getting used to. So I see a question in the chat, what's been covered? I think I just recapped that. So hopefully I answered your question. And how does Vuex fit into this? I'm going to actually, in probably 15 minutes, we're going to be looking at how to create a global store for your application using this API. So I think that will answer your question at that point. My short answer is it does fit into this, but I think this will change the way, this new API will change the way that we manage state and data in our Vue applications for the better. And I'll kind of get into that in this next section. So the next thing that we want to do is, because we've refactored all this, right? But that doesn't really help us, because we'd still need to, we're trying to implement the same pagination and filtering on the videos page, right? Using the same logic, sharing that logic, not copying and pasting. What I've done now is just made it easier to copy and paste. So what we need to do is really abstract this into its own chunk, right? So what we're going to do for our filtering is we're going to copy this filtering. We're going to copy this bit out of here, and we're going to go put that into its own function. So if I open up my files, you can see I've got a folder here. The naming here doesn't matter at all. I choose to call these composition functions composables, and I'm using this use prefix that came from the React world and React hooks. Again, naming is not really important there, but it's just kind of the standard for what I like to do. So we're gonna open up this use filter function, and we're gonna accept a few props because we are on a separate function, right? So we need to kind of abstract this and allow it to be very flexible. So we're gonna accept 2 parameters. We're gonna accept that we should filter, and the query. This is the value that we're gonna use to filter by, right? So we're gonna take care of that first to-do item, and then we'll come down here and paste in our actual filtering code, and then we will return our filtered posts, right? And this might not always be posts, so we can rename this to filtered items. And then this all posts isn't the right thing anymore, because, right, we're just making this more generally usable. So we're not talking about posts, right? We're talking about this use filter function that will be generally usable anywhere in our application that we have some items of a certain type, and we want to filter those by a reactive piece of data that gets updated maybe by an input or button. So this is just a really basic filtering implementation. And so all posts, we're going to replace those references with items. And we're going to, yep. And then our search query, we're going to replace this query. We don't really need that anymore because we're accepting that as a parameter. So we're going to say, but then we need to update this, because that query that gets passed in here is going to be a ref, right? We're expecting some reactive data, so we should expect that they're passing in a ref. We can also use some different parts of the composition API to make sure they're passing a ref, make sure they're passing in reactive data also. But for now, we're just going to check any place that we do query, and we're going to say query.value so that we get that reactiveness. And then the last thing here that is kind of important, as you pull this function, these pieces of the composition API out of one place into another, move them around, you always got to make sure that you have your imports sorted. So I'm just going to let VS Code do it for me here. But you need to make sure it was throwing an error because this wasn't being imported, and I let VS Code kind of do its auto import deal for me, which is really amazing. And we now have this computed property. So now we've got this function, right, that we've created called useFilter. Now we need to go use it, and it's doing everything that we need it to do. We're just exporting that so we can import it. This is very similar to how you would create a component and export it, right? You create something, you export it so that in another file, another component, another piece of your application, you can import it. So we're going to hop back into our articles page, and we're going to, for the first time, import and use a custom-made composition function. And this is really where I think the value will become apparent to you. So we're going to import use filter from, and we just got to get the path to that, which is like /composable/use filter. And we're just going to import that use filter. And then down here, because we have just returned one thing, right? Filtered items, we can just say const. And what are we calling it? We're calling it filtered posts, right? So filtered posts equals, and we're going to say use filter. And then what were our 2 parameters that we needed to pass it? VS Code will actually give us a nice little hint for that, we need to pass it some items and our query. So our items is all posts because that's what we want to filter. And then our query is our search query. So search query doesn't get abstracted away. It's a piece of reactive data that lives in this, right? Because it has to do, we're using it to vModel to up here. It's not really a part of what we're abstracting away. We're just abstracting away the piece that says, give me some posts, give me a query to filter by, and I'll filter them and give them back to you. So if we save that and we refresh, this may or may not work. Might take a little bit of adjusting, and it does work. So we've successfully abstracted this filtering functionality, and now we can use this in any component, right? So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to jump over into our videos layout, which we're going to use for our videos, and we can paste this into setup, right? And we are copying and pasting one thing over, but we're not copying and pasting any logic, right? All of our logic is already contained in here. And if we wanted to like abstract the search query into this and make it a little bit less abstract, make it a little bit more specific use case, we could. But we just need to fix our imports here for ref. And we need to fix our use filter. And again, VS Code's amazing. It's giving us exactly what we need for our imports. And then we need to return filtered. And we're going to call this filtered videos, right? Because they're not posts. And we're going to pass in all videos instead of all posts. So we're going to get rid of this. And we're going to return, just say videos, right? And then we'll return that as our filtered video. So we're saying return some data to the template called videos, and that data should be our filter videos, and that's going to be filtered here. And then we need to bind our search query up here on our input. Just basic Vue stuff, nothing special here. And then if we go to our videos, we should be able to, let's see, search query, and we need to return that. Yep. Okay, so we've got our, and you can see if I kind of change this initial to hey, you can see that it updates here and it is filtering, so it's hiding those. And then, if I want to get this one or any ones related to Tailwind, I can type Tailwind. And so, with one function call, we've implemented this functionality that previously there wasn't really a great way to do across multiple components in a way that is abstract, right? And it works anywhere in our application, and it doesn't require a component to do something that doesn't really have any UI to go with it. So that's really the power of the composition API, is to be able to abstract and share logic, stateful logic with reactive data, computer properties. We'll look at, you can do lifecycle things, which are, component related, but you can abstract pretty much anything you can do in a component into one of these composable functions, which you can use anywhere in your application, which is really, really powerful concept. And I think it's going to really change the way we use Vue for the better. So the second feature, which we want to implement, we've already done this, so I'm going to breeze through this pretty quickly, but we've got the second feature in here, pagination. So I'm just going to copy this, and we're going to do the same thing we just did. We're going to move it into its own hook. We need to accept some parameters. Looks like I already did that. So we've got our item and then our link to the page, right? So you might want to say, I want to paginate it and I want to do 3 per page. You might want to do 10 per page. So those are the two things that we're doing there. I'll let VS Code take care of our importing. So I'm going to paste this in. I'm just going to hit ref there and let VS Code take care of it. Same thing for computed. If I type that and hit enter, it'll fix my import for me. And then we need to return all of this stuff. And we're going to do our return a little bit differently in this function. We're going to return multiple things. So we're going to return an object of things and things that we need to expose from this function. I'll talk about this a little bit more in just a second. But the things which we're missing out here are show more posts, paginated posts, and can show more posts, right? So we're going to expose those 3 things from our composition function. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, show more posts, paginated posts, can show more posts. And we're going to rename posts to items because we want this to be agnostic, right? We don't want it to be related to posts. You should be able to paginate anything. So we're going to update this, and this to be, I need to get one more. Typing skills are a little subpar when I'm streaming. And we'll go items, and then that should fix most of our errors. And then the page length, just fixing up a few things here. We don't need to define page length because we're getting it as a prop. And then the rest of this looks pretty good. And then we're not filtering filtered posts, right? We want to be able to filter anything they pass in. So we're just going to call it items. But you'll notice here the items we're calling dot value on because we're expecting a ref, right? These items might be static. They might just be an array of things, but it very much could be a ref. So we need to do items dot value. And again, like I said, we'll look at it if we have a second. We'll look at it to make sure what you can do to make sure that when someone passes in data, it is a ref, or if they don't, just automatically convert it to a ref. I think I can do that right here by saying like const items equals, and then I think it's to ref. Yep. Which we'll look at a little bit more in a second. I could just do pretty much this with a few syntax changes. So we could say if they just pass in, if they up here when they're calling it, they did use pagination and just passed an array, right, of things. They want to paginate that, that's fine. It's not reactive though. So if we call dot value on that, it would break. So what we can do is just make sure that even if they don't pass a ref, even if they just pass a primitive value like an array, it'll just kind of automatically wrap that up. So what this would do is pretty much just return something that looks like value and then items. So it's pretty simple. But we're expecting them to pass in reactive data. That's why we're calling dot value. So that's something that is going to come up a lot as you use the composition API, dealing with refs, dealing with reactive values. Got a question in the chat. How do you constrain the types of the arguments to the use filter function? If possible, only array and object. So let's look at the filter function real quick. So we're expecting an items array. And I think I just talked about that a little bit. You could, because this isn't a component, these aren't props, right? They're just normal arguments. Let me think about that. Yeah, so you could do manual type checking, right? You come down here and say if items type of items does not equal objects, right? Because arrays are object. You could do some manual type checking. There may be some sort of plugin out there for this at some point. I think it's a good question, how to kind of handle your types, because you also might want to set like a type to say, be able to say like items, and then be able to tell it somehow like, hey, this is a ref, right? So I should expect a ref. And if they just pass in an array, instead of handling it myself, I just want you to deal with it and throw an error to them. I think the best answer to this question is use something like TypeScript or Flow, which kind of handles your type checking for you. I know that Vue 3 was built with TypeScript, so it'll be very compatible. My guess is you'll be easily able to specify like items should be a ref or something like that. So TypeScript or some sort of type checker is probably your best bet there. And then what VS Code plugin for auto resolving imports? No VS Code plugin. It automatically resolves them if you're using Vue 3, depending on exactly what you're doing. But for most imports in Vue, if you're using the Vetur plugin, VETUR, it'll kind of auto resolve your imports for you, which is awesome. So I'm going to keep rolling. I'm going to hop back over into our pagination. If you have any more questions about kind of what I've been looking at, I know I'm going pretty quickly through this, so drop me any questions, even if it's basic stuff. I'm happy to kind of revisit because I really want to get the fundamentals down here. So I'm going to hop back in here and just swap out this. I just want to get this back working. Okay, and I think that looks good. And then we're going to come back into our where we're using it in our let's see, in our home file, and we need to just update a couple of these things. This is now show more items, and we'll actually, I'm going to copy that to use up here. And so we just need to pull in our pagination, right? So we're going to say const, and then I'm going to destructure these three things from use pagination, and we need to import that up here. So I'm just going to drop that down and then replace filter with pagination. And then we're going to say, is it pagination or paginate? Pagination. Okay. use pagination. And what do we need to pass it? Again, VS Code's helping us out here. We need to pass it some items. So we're going to pass it our filtered posts because we want to filter them and then paginate them. And then the page length, and we'll just pass that 3. And then, we're not using computed in here. That's actually kind of a nice error to show up because it kind of shows that when you're using these functions that you've generated, you're not often pulling in like computed or watch or something like that into an actual component. You're often using that more in your functions that you're creating to using components. So you won't always be needing kind of all of these. So the imports aren't really too annoying. But it's just kind of an interesting thing you see as I refactored this into kind of more abstracted chunks. You no longer need to use as much of the composition API primitives inside of your components. They usually kind of move some of that out into more chunked, right? So I'm going to go back here. We're going to hop over to articles and let's see if our pagination's working. It is. And that is awesome. Let's see, just checking here. Trying to see. I actually wasn't expecting that to work, so I'm kind of surprised that it does. There it is. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I just need to swap out a few of these names. I was like, wow, I somehow did half the work that I thought that I needed to do without even knowing it, but no. So we just got to swap out these posts for items, and then we should be back to working. And yep, perfect. So we now have that functionality abstracted, and we can really, really easily implement that on our videos page because it's all wrapped up. So I'm just going to copy our import and copy this bit, and we're going to go over to videos and just replicate that, right? It's just one function call, just like we kind of moved over earlier. And we just got to copy these down here, and we're going to say filtered videos, and then we need to return these things to the template and just wire some things up. So we got our paginated items, which we're going to pass into videos, and then we've got our button, and we're just going to find the click event here to load more. What is the terminology? Show more items. Yep, show more items, and we'll bind disabled to if there's no more items to show. And then we've got kind of our fully functional pagination functionality with filtering, right? We can filter and paginate. So let's just paginate these by 1 instead of 3. So only show 1 at a time. We can load more. And, we'll search for, see if there's like 2 view ones. And that just kind of takes care of both our pagination and our filtering for us here. So paginates and filters. So we've kind of abstracted all that functionality into a really simple abstracted function that we can use anywhere in our application. That's kind of the meat of what I have to say. So hit me up with questions if you have them. I've got 2 more things that I want to walk through pretty quickly here. If I can get to both of them, might just get to one. I may have to save the other one. But we got a question in the chat. I'm not sure I understood the difference between ref and reactive. So that's a good question. And I will demonstrate that really quickly. We actually haven't looked at reactive yet because I'm not really a big proponent of it. I think for reactive data, you should mostly be using ref. But we can look at it over here and we'll just jump into home. And what we'll do is we'll just say up here above everything else, we'll say const, let's call it state equals, and then we'll import this reactive, and that's the same thing, right? It's coming from Vue, and this works very similarly to ref, but allows you to have multiple pieces of data together. So we could say, name Jake Dome, and gender, we'll just say male, right? So you can have multiple pieces of data together, and then we can just return that state to our template, and then up here we could say state name, and then to state gender, and that's going to render out for us. It's just going to let you know that I am Jake Dome and I'm a male. So it allows you to do reactive data, but in groups. So instead of just for one value, like this query value, if you have a group of data, you can pass that into this reactive function. Um, the nice thing about doing it like this is that you don't have to call dot value. So if I console.log state out and then we look at that, you'll see that it's an object and it doesn't, I mean, it's got a proxy on it because it's doing view things, but you can see that the name and gender is here. And I don't have to do state.value because we're passing it in a function. That's the way JavaScript works. It already has a way to make that reactive. So it doesn't need to do the value wrapping. But when you're working with multiple composition functions, and I don't really have time to get into this fully, but when you're working with multiple composition functions, just knowing that everything is a ref and you have to do dot value is really helpful to me because you're not kind of jumping between, is it reactive but an object, or is it a ref? I tend to like to make everything a ref. Some reading I would do on that, check out the composition API documentation, which is composition-api.vuejs.org. And you can kind of look at the to refs function, which what it will do is we'll take your, I'm going to make this bigger so you can see it on the stream. Actually, yeah, there you go. And what it will do is it will take your reactive state, right? So you've got some state foo var, and it will turn it into an object of refs instead of a reactive object. This really helps working between multiple composition functions. But for just one composition, for general working with data, unless you have kind of a group of information that goes together, which is one of my last examples, not sure if we'll get to it, then I prefer to use ref. So, but that's how reactive works. So it's very, very similar. You just don't have to call dot value, but it's reactive data, and it's very similar to how you'd work in Vue. If you want to just group all your data together, you could, just have a data object, which you can use, and you can put all of your keys together. So instead of, doing search query ref, you could do search query up here. And then I don't know what our other data was. It was like page, right? So we have page 0, and then down here, instead of search query being a ref, it would just be data dot search query, which is kind of like doing this dot search query. It kind of gets you back to that same grouping your stuff by what it is instead of by feature, which I'm not a fan of, which is another reason why I like refs, because it keeps you to kind of keeping things that are separate. But yeah, that's a great question. If I have an existing Vuex store, answering a question here, if I have an existing Vuex store, can I access it in the setup or composables? Or does anything that uses state MI component have to use the old API? Great question. Most libraries, I think, will provide a way for you to use it within the composition API with Vue 3. So there's definitely going to have to be some like catching up on that front. Composition API has been available for people to use for 3 to 6 months now as kind of a plugin, and maybe even longer than that. I've been messing around with it for a year. So I think people have already kind of planned for that. I know that Vuex is going to do a release that's compatible with Vue 3 and the composition API. So I think most things you'll be able to do within the composition API. It's kind of just a question of how much you have to change about how it works and what kind of new innovations come out of having the composition API that changes how you work. So there's very little breaking changes because of it. You shouldn't have any breaking changes because of the composition API, but there may be some new things that you have to learn because libraries that couldn't really provide this type functionality before now can, and so they will. Getting back to the Vuex question, I'll work on our last feature here, and I'm going to go, let's see, what did I do here to mess this up? Reactive is defined, state is not defined. Yeah, okay. Just got to get rid of the stuff that I just put in here for example purposes, and then we'll be back to working. One thing that I was going to do is I'm going to refactor this search bar. Let's see, name is undefined. Yep, here it is. Okay. I'm going to refactor the search bar to be a global search bar so that there's not one for each page. There's just one that works on both pages. And so we're going to come in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it. We're going to get rid of this search bar. And then we're going to have to fix some stuff for this to work. We're probably wrapping up here in a few minutes. Thanks for hanging around. I'm going to keep rolling on this feature, but as I do it, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat and I will answer them before we wrap up. So go ahead and ask those while I'm working on this. So I'm going to remove that search bar from our home and from our videos, and we're going to consolidate it, and then we're going to show how you can just share data between two components using the composition API. So we've removed it from both components. Neither of them have search anymore. This probably should break some stuff because, you can't do our filtering anymore, obviously, translating. Probably got to refresh to get that. Yep. Okay, so we've got rid of our search bar, and then I'm just going to go to our app, and I have another search bar there that's a global search bar, and that's not bound to anything right now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little store. So this is composables. I'm just going to name this a composable for now, even though it's more of a store, and I think there's more to be discovered on that front. I'm going to say use search. And what that's going to do is we're going to come in here and that's going to return a function. So kind of our normal setup, we're going to say use search, and we'll get rid of kind of the extra stuff on my screen so you can see this. And we will just take, do we need any parameters here? We'll take a default value for the search. No, we won't. We'll do nothing there. And what we're going to do here is up to this point, what we've done is we've used these composition functions, composition APIs like ref within the function. So every time you call this function, it gives you like a unique ref, right? So the pagination for this page doesn't apply to the pagination for this page, which is what we want because that logic is contained within this function that we're calling. What we're going to do here is create a reactive store, which will actually just use a ref here, and we'll say query search query. And we'll use a ref, and that'll import for us. And we'll just, set that to a default value of nothing. And then in our use search, all we're going to do is we're going to return. Actually, I am going to do a reactive just to kind of show how that works. We'll do a store, and we'll call that reactive. And then we'll get rid of ref up here because it's going to be mad I didn't use what I imported. And inside of this, we're just going to have a query. What did I call it before? Query value. Let's call it query. Search query. There it is. Search query, and that's going to be set to nothing. And then inside of this use search function, which are the users of this composition composable, I like to call it our composition function. All we're going to do is return our store. So all they're going to get is the store that we've created, and then we're just going to export use search, export default search. Okay, and then we're going to come into our app and we're going to let's just up here in between these two, we're just going to put a div, and we will, in this, we'll create a script because we don't have one. Script, and we'll use the setup function, right, to use our composable, and then we'll say const store equals, call this search store equals use store, and we need to import that up here. Let's see if I can get autocomplete to do it for me. Like it will, that's fine. Use search. Well, so we'll up here, we'll import, and we'll go dot dot. Oh, we're not in the folder I thought we were. So, oh man, screen jumped on me, hit the wrong shortcut. Okay, so we're gonna go composables, and then use search, and then we're just gonna import use. Can't type right now. Use search, and we'll just call that, and then we'll return the search store. And I'll walk through kind of what this is doing because I know I'm moving pretty quickly. And we'll go to our search store and we'll show the search query. And then here we're going to copy the same thing we're showing, and we're going to vmodel this input to it. And let's see if that works for us, right? So we've got this and we say, hey, okay. So we've got reactive data coming from a store that we created. So you know how you create Vuex stores for things you want to share across components, right? So this is a very similar type model, but you don't really have to do anything special other than create a store and then return it. And this store is consistent across multiple pages, right? It doesn't change, and we can actually use it in multiple different components because we're initializing the store outside of the function. So this is a way you can create a store and share it across multiple types of components. And this is why I say that I think we might see some changes to the way that we manage our state and that we share data across components, because we now have this. This is 10 lines, and I can make it a few shorter if I delete some of my white space. This is 10 lines to give you reactive data across your functions, and it allows us to componentize our data into these stores that make sense, right? So instead of having one big global store called just store and you import it everywhere, you could have a store for your search related stuff, right? And a store for your pagination. That one doesn't really make sense. A store for your user. So instead of doing like, store in your code, instead of doing, give me console.log big superstore dot user dot whatever, dot user dot name, you might just import something like this in the future. You might just import user from stores user, and then console log your user dot name, because your data is now broken up into sizable chunks, which you can do with Vuex, right? Vuex modules. But I think being able to do it on your own without kind of the overhead of something like Vuex is going to be really powerful. So if I just kind of finish implementing this, we've got this search, but it doesn't work, right? It's not searching our pages for us. So I'm just going to get rid of this. I'll leave it. It's fine. No, I'm going to get rid of it. It's gone. And I'm going to come and see, all we have to do to use search is this, right? And so I'm just going to copy these things, and we'll come into our home, and we will, where we were doing our filtered posts by this search query, we'll replace that with use search, and then our search query will pass in. I actually kind of made a mistake here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create search query equals ref, because right, this is expecting a ref. We got to remember that, and we're going to pass in search store dot search query. That should get us back up and running with our search working. If not, I think you know where I was going with that, and we just got to adjust this path. And then we've got the search that we can do, and we'll let's see. I implemented this on articles, not videos. I should be able to come up here and type ADA, and it's not working because it's a last second demo. But yeah, that's kind of you saw how it can work, where you have reactive data and you can abstract that into a composable. I think we're going to see a lot more libraries giving you a really, really thin layer on top of um, these new composition APIs that help you manage your data. So one of the questions is, the only disadvantage I can see is the tracking of mutations, et cetera, that the dev tools give. That's a great point. And I think that, like I said, there's going to be a thin layer on top of these composables. Someone already worked on one of these. I think it was Eduardo, who put out something called Pina for Vue. And what that does is it gives you all the dev tools and things that you kind of get from Vuex or from a normal thing. It kind of gives you some structure too, right? You have some state, some getters, and some actions. But it overall works very similar to what I was saying, where you kind of pull in your store and then you have it and you can use that data. So instead of kind of Vuex having to kind of reinvent the wheel under the hood, we'll just see some new cool thin layers on top of these new composables. So a couple things I didn't mention. There's some really, really cool other APIs. We didn't get to do watch, but I think you can kind of understand how that works. It watches your data and does normal Vue watching things. And you kind of call that like watch, and then you pass it a function. Watch effect, which is a new lifecycle kind of composable hook that will be really helpful. There's read only, so you can take some of your ref or reactive and tell people you can't change this, you can just consume it. And then I went into the reactive API just a little bit. And then there's kind of these other ones which are really just advanced to help you if you're libraries or you're building more complex composition functions. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm check questions real quick. I will put up the GitHub with this and publish that. So keep your eye out on Twitter, or maybe Tara can talk to that at the end where that should show up. But you can follow me on Twitter at Jake Dome. And I'll tweet it out later today, and you can kind of test this out on your own. If you have any questions, I love messing around with this type thing, especially the composition API. So if you have any questions, please shoot them to me on Twitter, and I will be more than happy to hop on with you and, answer any questions and help you kind of work through learning the composition API. Thanks so much. That is all I have for you today. Appreciate all the great questions.